So it's time to do a class tier list for Module 23 Neverwinter. It's been about 2 months since it's launched with the introduction of Dragon Hunts along with the new Master Trial Rise of Tiamat. So in this video I'd like to rank each of the classes across 5 different tiers. Now don't get confused when we go and rank tanks with DPS and also healers. You can consider them in their separate own category. You can't compare a DPS versus a tank because one's job is to do damage and the other one is to absorb damage, whereas the healer is to heal that damage. So when we rank them like so, you need to just compare healers versus healers and tanks versus tanks. Now before we get started, keep in mind that this is my tier list from my experience playing the game. I do have nearly 4,000 hours played within this game, a lot of it spent within those master trials in Endgame. For example, Tower of the Mad Mage, Zariel, Crown of Keldron and Rise of Tiamat, as that is the content I feel most fun playing. And so my tier list will largely reflect that type of endgame content, especially how much damage each of the classes can perform in said boss fights, where your damage really matters. We shall go through each class, give a little bit of information on each, and then give them a general ranking on said tier list. Just keep in mind what module it is. This is for module 23. Sometime in November we'll get module 24. We may get gear adjustments and new gear that could change these rankings altogether. So initially when you start Neverwinter, you're going to create a new character. You're going to choose a race, and yes, they will impact how well you can perform, and I'm leaving that to another video on which one you should choose. But continuing on, you then have to make your choice of the 9 different classes. Each class has 2 paragon paths. So as example, a cleric can be a damage dealer, aka a DPS, or a healer. A paladin could be a healer or a tank. A fighter, a damage dealer, DPS, or a tank. And so that is why on my tier list you will see that there is a fighter tank and a fighter DPS, and they will be ranked separately. So we'll first start out with the cleric. Now as a cleric damage dealer, you will want to go on the paragon path, the arbiter. You can see an example set up here for a build for single target boss fights. And what's unique about the cleric is it has powers which cost divinity, and you can use those powers to deal heavy damage. And the benefit of these powers costing divinity means you can use a lot of them within a short period of time. And then you can take full advantage of Prophecy of Doom, where you will deal a big damage hit depending on how much damage you've done within that short period of time. So yes, the Arbiter is all about that burst damage, switching between casting 2 different encounter powers and to use your Prophecy of Doom at the correct time, obtaining massive amounts of damage. You get your timing right and you're rewarded with your perfect balance to fill your divinity back to full. I'm going to have to rank the Cleric DPS in A tier. It's not bad, but I wouldn't say it's the best either, mainly due to its high skill ceiling required necessary to actually perform as good as other classes. Moving on to the Barbarian damage dealer, we have the Blade Master. Again, here's an example of a build setup that you might use within single target. It's a pretty friendly class to play, as you'll generally just use your powers when you can. You have your certain encounter powers which can do quite a big chunk of burst damage, and then you have this rage meter to do massive amounts of damage within that window, being able to attack much faster. And then you can see once your rage is gone, your encounter powers are nearly off cooldown again, which allows you to regenerate that rage meter really fast and then being able to attack again. Overall, the Barbarian is a new player friendly class and can perform very well in the damage output in the current meta. You have a very good mix of AoE and single target, excelling a bit more in my opinion with single target. And AoE, you kind of need the enemies to stick around to be able to ramp up that damage, as you have more consistent damage rather than burst damage in AoE. AoE being area of effect, where you have lots of enemies nearby. But you can see how quickly you can shred through a group of enemies just with your AoE at will there. Only the tankiest will be left standing after a few seconds. So the Barbarian DPS I will rank in S tier, as it's a very solid class to play. Pretty user friendly, and ultimately its damage potential is pretty high up there. So next up we move to the Warlock damage dealer, or DPS. Now here you will be playing as the Hellbringer. Again, here's an exemplary build setup you would use for single target. A Warlock mainly focuses on dealing a lot of damage over time. They don't have as much burst potential as other classes, but if they have the ability to have time on target, they can definitely output massive amounts of damage. They also have the benefit of not needing to switch up many powers when they want to go from single target to AoE. All you will probably need to do is, on let's say the build I have right now, switch to Fiery Bolt instead of your Killing Flames. And you also have a very nice class feature I wish every class had, giving you the ability, no matter of positioning, to gain full combat advantage against your targets. Now the general playstyle, at least in single target, will be to just spam down your encounter powers, use your tab power to get the cooldown reduction, and then a bit of your at will, another tab, and then you just spam down those encounters again. So in its current state, the Warlock excels very nicely, so I'm gonna have to put it in S tier. A fairly new player friendly class with just spamming your encounter powers pretty much when you got them. Next up we have the Rogue. Now you will normally want to be going with the Rogue Assassin, as it excels the most within single target damage, and in AoE it's just a lot more user friendly. We just have to switch out like 2 encounter powers and you're good to go. Now in my opinion, the Rogue is like one of the easiest classes to play, with getting the most reward in return. You can deal massive amounts of damage in burst with your encounters that are very nice and hard hitting, and you can deal pretty decent damage over time with your at will, just having bleeds and damage over time effects on your enemies, especially in the current meta with your Band of Air. Overall, the Rogue is absolutely thriving in the current meta, having a very good mix of single target and AoE, attacking multiple targets. In my opinion, it's one of the best in AoE, especially because of its ability to go invisible and then gain combat advantage against its enemies regardless of positioning. Unfortunately, as soon as you attack, that invisibility effect is gone. But ultimately, yes, the Rogue DPS again has got to go in S+ tier. I'm gonna rank him a little bit higher than the Warlock. I would put him there on the left. Then, because of his new player friendliness, there's not a lot going on that you need to optimize other than pushing the buttons on your encounters and holding your buttons for your at-wills. So next up we go to the Fighter. And here you will have the Fighter Dreadnought. And this again is an example build. And what makes the Fighter unique is they have massive hitting encounter powers, along with a pretty heavy hitting at will. Now what you will need to make sure and do is make full use of your tab ability, which you'll go into this squat to fill up your bar here. But once you're in combat and attacking things, once you have the right feat set up, it's very easy to maintain that, and that essentially just gives you a passive boost in damage, and then you can use those encounter powers whenever they're off cooldown to just rack up massive amounts of damage on your hits. But overall it struggles a bit with survivability, and thus not very new player friendly. You only have a shield to block attacks. You can't get out of certain mechanics to essentially avoid the damage like you could on other classes. Whereas on the Fighter, you have to sit there and just tank the hit, whether that be on your shield, which will get quickly depleted when facing tough enemies. This dummy is pretty puny, and thus you only have your HP pool left, and so you will die very quickly. And that's why I don't think I can rank the Fighter as high as some people might wish. Once you do go and master the Fighter and learn the content when and where you can actually hit, the fighter can definitely rank pretty high, especially in its raw single target damage output. But for now, I'm just going to have to put him in A tier. His AoE damage is a little bit clunky as well, requiring you to cast an at-will before actually using one, and then their area, the radius, isn't exactly that big. So again, in A tier it is. Next up we have the Bard. Now, as its DPS path, you have the Songblade. And here you're not going to have to learn as much of the playing songs as you would on the Healer, so definitely a little bit more friendly on that front, but still a little bit clunky with regards to having to cast these songs. You can use keybinds, of course, but ultimately the way it will play is you'll try and have your 2 songs active all the time, and from there it's simply just spamming encounters when you have them and then holding down your at-will button. Trying to make sure we have our Ballad of the Hero up and then just spamming our encounters when we get them. You have your ability to gain like improvised versions with this feat of your encounters, which allows you to cast a lot more encounter powers than any other class would. But on the other side, those encounter powers don't exactly hit for a whole lot, and the majority of your damage in group content will actually come from this ability, Mystifying Strikes. Ultimately, the Bard is not a new player friendly class. I wouldn't say it's as bad as where it was. It's had a few fixes, and so I'm still tempted to put it in B tier, as it still does rely on having a team to actually output a lot of damage. But again, I'm just gonna put it in average because it's on the same borderline of a higher skill ceiling combined with a higher luck ceiling. You need to be lucky on your procs and the timing of them in order to deal a lot of damage. But overall, you have decent AoE damage and get through solo content very smoothly. And so I'll put him in A tier. Next up, we have the Ranger. The Paladin is just a tank or a healer. Here you will mainly be going with the Hunter in order to maximize your single target damage, which is again the majority of endgame trial content. And so this is an example of a build setup, and what's special about the Ranger is they have their tab power, which can allow them to switch stance, going between using, let's say, some axes here or using your bow. We summon our dummy here, and here's using the bow, and then here's like using your axes. Now, we don't exactly have the fanciest axe powers right now, as generally this build is orientated around just shooting arrows with your bow. You can sometimes switch stance to essentially, let's say, have a buff power to give everybody a shield, but normally you're just going to be switching stances just for this rate of change feat and then casting those powers. You can get like keybinds to make this really easy, but ultimately that is how you would play a Ranger. It's generally just sitting there shooting your bow. You can make much more interesting builds, and I recommend you do so, but in endgame, the most builds I've seen use the same Hunter build, maximizing their single target damage just by shooting those arrows. They have pretty good AoE damage with the ability to cause like roots on their targets just to lock down enemies. Now, the Ranger has struggled a little bit within the current meta with getting topped by, let's say, rogues and warlocks, at least from what I've seen. So I'm gonna have to put the Ranger in S tier. Not the best, and could very well become the best, at least one of the best, when the Band of Air gets nerfed, but currently it's in S tier. So next up, we finally move to the Wizard. Now, the Wizard does struggle a bit, and you will usually want to be just going with the Arcanist power gun path, with this kind of usual setup here as a build, and it struggles because its powers just don't really have the amount of punch that you would expect. However, it can still do adequately well, especially with its ability of a unique daily power, allowing you to essentially spam down your encounter powers. We use our daily here, and you can see the rate at which our encounter powers cool down just becomes insane. And this can lead to the Wizard dealing a lot of burst damage, which can be very useful in certain content, Tar the Mad Mage. But since we've kind of moved away from the meta of stacking lots of action point regeneration, that's kind of gone down the drain a bit, it has made the wizards struggle a bit more, since they can't really use their daily power, let's say, twice every minute, where they now need to save it, especially for the artifact call. Otherwise, the wizard has decent AoE damage, but again struggles a bit like the barbarian, takes a bit of time to actually get the damage done, and if other classes are there like a rogue who just shreds through everything, then everything's going to be dead before you do a lot of damage within AoE. Skill ceiling, not particularly high, but in combination with the sheer lack of raw damage, I'm just going to have to put the wizard in A tier, along with the cleric, the fighter, the bard. They can all work. They all do their jobs very well. It's just they could be a lot better to be on par with these other 4 DPS classes. And I think that's a fair enough ranking. Again, just keep in mind these are from my personal experiences from playing each of the classes, at least a little bit I did, and otherwise talking to other people and seeing how well they perform. So now we're going to move on to the healers. We have 4 different healers here, and initially we start with the Warlock. Now here you will have the Soul Weaver path with an example build set up like such, and essentially the Warlock could be one of the best healers in the game. Unfortunately, their heals are limited to areas such as this, which can be very good when people are grouped up. But there's certain content, especially in area of effect fights where you have lots of enemies, people are generally spread out. Or when you're fighting, let's say, dragon heads in Tiamat, you'll generally want to be spread out, otherwise you're taking unnecessary amounts of damage or risking dying to the bombs. Now, the raw healing output, again, like I mentioned, is one of the best of the healers. But having it bound to an area of effect, unlike other healer classes, limits it. Again, similar to all healers, you're going to have a pool like we see on the left there, which then dictates how many healing powers you can cast. All of them will cost like Soul Weave, Performance, or Divinity. And so you can heal quite a lot pretty quickly. It's just then you're limited on how much of the resource you have left to actually heal. And otherwise you all have like a healing at will power, which again will still use Divinity, but will allow you to, let's say, top up just individuals when they're on low. So the Warlock Healer, I'm gonna have to put in the A tier. It's still very good and very good with what it does. The problem is what it does isn't usually the best in all content. Generally people will be spread out, and then you're going to struggle and have to make the decision of healing 1 or 2 people. But in content where people can all be grouped up and be coordinated, it can be one of the best healers with the raw amount of heals. And let's move on to the Bard. Now here you have the Minstrel. Again, here's like a build setup, and it's going to be pretty challenging to play as a newer player, as you're going to have to play quite a lot of your different songs. Generally what you want to be doing is having your song Rejuvenating Carol active all of the time. That will give everybody that small heal over time, allowing that to just top up people when they take a small hit here and there. Otherwise, you will want to make sure you have your Sheltering Etude active, allowing your allies to get quite a decent heal whenever they drop below 50% hit points. Then you will probably want to have your buff song active, which is your Blaze Flamenco, and that will allow your allies either to run a bit faster and also deal a bit more damage depending on the buffs right there. Those are the main 3 songs you want to always have active. And so with that toolkit, the Bard can be one of the best healers in the game. It's not going to match the player friendliness of a cleric, as we'll mention in a second, but it has the added benefit of having a much higher skill ceiling, along with providing your teammates with up to 15% extra damage dealt, reduced incoming damage, and increased outgoing healing, which can be massive just with party-wide buffs. Overall, the Bard has one of the best toolkits, but with the highest skill ceiling of all the healers. So the way it stands, if you simply just play it like keeping your 3 songs active all the time, you will generally be in S tier. Bit better than the Warlock since you're not bound by an area, and on top of that you can provide much bigger and increased buffs to your allies, utility along with just increased raw effectiveness. So the Bard is definitely in S tier. Moving on, let's go back to our Cleric, which we actually skipped. And here you will have the Devout. And here's an example build setup, and you just have a lot of raw outgoing healing. You can cause your allies with Healing Word to receive massive amounts of just heal over time, which can be so friendly for a new player since you won't have to do a lot. Just make sure that the Healing Word is always active. Keep in mind it lasts 18 seconds. If somebody dies, it expires, and after the 18 seconds it expires. So make sure to have it cast again before it's expired on somebody. And then you could use something like Bastion to cause a massive heal on like one target. That's over 500k. That's more than half my HP. Or you can target multiple people and heal for a bit less, and then just use one power to cause your divinity to regen a bit faster, or use another power to increase the amount of healing you do. And then you can use an at-will to also increase the amount of heals you do, along with either having an at-will to deal some damage, to gain some action points in combat, which I definitely recommend. Generally you want to go with your Scattering Light, and ultimately just keeping up your Healing Word and then using your daily power, which you can get pretty quickly by switching between your at-will and your tab. You can cast like your Angel, which is your Guardian of Life, or your Hallowed Ground. Your Angel will just heal everybody in a burst, and then stick around if you have this certain feat to heal people for up to every 45 seconds. Can be very useful. You have a lot of just automated healing, so again, it's a very new player friendly class, and just with the raw amount of healing it can output in endgame right now, it is definitely one of the best. So it definitely deserves to go in S+ tier. Again, if you really master the Bard, I would definitely put him in S+ tier, if not higher than that. So next up, the last healer is the Paladin. Now when I started playing Paladin, hands down, it was the best in the game. You have your Oathkeeper Paragon Path with, this is usually my build setup right here, and you have the unique ability to cause shields on your targets that you heal. For example, we use our Divine Touch, and you can see we obtain a pretty modest shield there. We can of course get it much higher when we use certain buffs and when we get a crit or not, using our area here to gain increased heal effectiveness along with regenerating our divinity back. And that's generally the bread and butter of a Paladin Healer. In trials you will generally use your Divine Shelter here to cast a shield on everybody. And so that's what makes the Paladin Healer unique. The ability to give targets this extra layer of protection, this shield, which makes it a very good synergy with, let's say, a Cleric Healer or a Bard Healer, just because you can add to your target's survivability and not compete with directly just healing them. Ultimately, again, just keep in mind of your divinity pool and how much you can actually heal then for that time. I found the Paladin to be definitely a lot more friendly than the Bard, since you don't have to do much, you don't have to manage much songs or anything. You just simply use your encounters and then cast your heal encounter power when your allies need it. Every now and again you can use your at-will to top somebody up, but that's about it. So I will rank the Paladin Healer still below the Bard, because the sheer amount of utility and buffs along with healing that the Bard can provide, and in line with the Warlock, as the Paladin still can be very good. It can still complete all content with healing your allies through it, but it struggles with the raw amount of heals it can provide, but does have the unique ability to provide those shields. So again, just going to be an A tier with a bunch of the other classes. And let's move on to our tanks, of which we have 3 of them. We start with the Barbarian, and here you will have the Sentinel power gun. And with a build setup as such, you can definitely switch between a few encounters, but overall what the Barbarian struggles in so much is threat generation. Yes, you can make it work. I've seen a few good Barbarian tanks out there, but they will still struggle to always maintain the aggro or the attention of the enemies over the ease you will get playing a fighter or a paladin. Comparatively, the Barbarian is a much higher skill ceiling tank to play, but it doesn't exactly get much reward for playing as one either. You do have the ability to gain insane amounts of hit points through buffs and defensiveness, and you can provide a little bit of added extra damage to your allies, but otherwise it doesn't provide the survivability support a fighter would, or the added buffs and healing support that a paladin would. So I can't rank the Barbarian tank as very high, but it does have the same kind of rage ability you would see on, let's say, your DPS path. You being able to go into this fury state and just automatically block all of the hits, which is very nice for a newer player, but just not being able to hold the attention of the enemies is a huge problem. Might not be such a problem when running with lower DPS new players, but once you get up there in the end game, people will steal the attention of your enemies all of the time, and if you're not taking the hits and your allies are instead of you, well, you're not really doing your job and you're kind of a waste of space. So unfortunately, the Barbarian tank is gonna have to go in B tier, pretty much the lowest on this tier list. It can be useful, but it's a struggle. So next up we have the Fighter. So here's an example build, and we have the Vanguard. Now, comparing the survivability of the Vanguard to the Justicar, that's the Fighter, and the Paladin, I found that the Fighter seems to be a lot more survivable, a lot easier to actually hold the attention of the enemies, and overall then just a little bit better. The difference between a Fighter and, in my opinion, the Paladin is the Paladin can be a little bit more adaptive. I'll explain when I go over the Paladin. Overall, the Fighter has a very good toolkit of having a mix of survivability along with some very good powers to hold the attention of your enemies, along with Enforced Threat, a power which can reduce the awareness of your enemies, allowing your allies to deal a lot more damage against them. So you're already providing a buff that increases everybody's damage, which everybody will love you for. Additionally, you can use your daily power to provide massive survivability buff within this area. It's a whole 20% lasting for 14 seconds. It's just, you can't do much else than sit here and do that. Very useful in specific situations where your allies just need that extra survivability to be able to tank a hit or two. That specifically happens in a lot of those endgame trials. Otherwise, you have the dig in ability, which allows you not to do much else than block and absorb a lot of damage. And you can do this whenever you want just by pressing your key. Now, you may just have seen there, you have the retaliate ability, which allows you to deactivate your dig in at a certain time and then deal a considerable amount of damage and increase threat to your target. You can see it activate there again. And otherwise, you could use the same build I have right now. Just spam down your encounters switching between your at-wills to essentially gain Threatening Rush for your extra increased threat, and then your Brazen Strike for your extra stamina regen, which will regenerate your shield faster, which allows you to block more hits. Generally, you will just use Dig In as your block ability and just switch between using it and other powers. get the timing right, and you'll master as a tank. Ultimately, I would say the fighter tank, just with its sheer effectiveness, is going to have to be an S+ tier compared to the other tanks. It just has a lot of raw survivability, a lot of raw damage and threat output, along with team support buffs. And so we move finally to the Paladin. And so here we have the Justicar. And here's my general build setup with my gear there. And the way it will work on a Paladin tank is you still have your divinity bar along with your shield bar like all tanks. Now that divinity bar you will use for certain powers. For example, you'll go and use your Templar's Wrath to essentially make sure the enemies have your attention. However, the problem with the Paladin versus the fighter is you're sacrificing that divinity to generate threat, whereas you could be using it for added survivability in this tabbed state here or this shield. And that is essentially like the dig-in for the fighter. The fighter doesn't have to make that decision. You can see we have to use our divinity when you look in endgame content for threat generation, which starves us for any divinity used for survivability. But otherwise, I would say the Paladin tank does have a lot more versatility than a fighter. Namely with Smite plus Divine Challenger, and then you always have a power to place you on top of the threat list so that you can immediately grab the attention of the enemy. And that is very useful in certain trials when you run with two tanks and you need to switch the aggro. You don't have to worry about a cooldown other than making sure you have enough divinity remaining to be able to use it. And on top of that, it's a ranged power, so you don't have to worry about your positioning on the arena after playing mechanics. With your tab ability, you also have team support. When you go into this shielded state during your tab, anybody behind you takes 10% less damage and also gets a heal, which means you can use this whenever you have divinity, which can be any of the time as long as you reserve a little bit, which unlike the fighter means you can have that extra 10% survivability boost to your allies at pretty much any time. Otherwise, you have aura buffs that you can increase to 4%, like crit rate, deflect rate, meaning either adding damage or protection to your allies with anybody within that area of effect of you, as you can see that big circle. Unfortunately, the Paladin tank with regards to ranking is going to have to just go in S tier. A bit below the fighter because you have to choose between threat and survivability, but otherwise, nonetheless, still a very good and a tank that works. So that is my tier list, my final tier list. Again, don't go comparing healers to tanks, tanks to DPS. They're completely separate roles. You just compare them against each other. Just keep in mind, a lot of the DPS rankings will change come Module 24 when we get the nerf to the Band of Air. It might happen a month, maybe sooner than that, but right now these are my rankings based on the current state of the game within the content I play, which is mostly Master Trials, Dragon Hunts, that challenging content which I find the most fun. So hopefully this was somewhat insightful, you guys, just to see my breakdown of each class and tier list. Recommend look for other people's opinions as well, as we all have our own bias. So again, I'd like to give a massive thank you to all of these channel members for the continued support. If you represented this well, consider leaving the video a like, and if you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.